There was a moment when it felt impossible to imagine television without Courteney Cox. For an entire generation, she wasn't just famous. She was familiar, safe, predictable in the best way. Week after week, millions of people welcomed her into their living rooms as Monica Geller on Friends, the controlling perfectionist with the sharp sarcasm, nervous energy, and hidden vulnerability that somehow made audiences feel understood. But what made Courteney Cox's story so strange was how quickly the laughter stopped. Because unlike some celebrities whose careers collapse overnight in scandal or controversy, Courteney's downfall felt quieter, slower, almost invisible at first. No explosive arrest. No catastrophic public meltdown. No single moment where Hollywood slammed the door in her face. Instead, her decline happened in a way that was far more unsettling. People simply stopped looking at her the same way. And for someone whose entire career had been built on being seen, that may have been even worse. By the late 2000s, the conversation around Courteney Cox had changed completely. The media no longer talked about her comedic timing or the cultural impact of Friends. Suddenly, headlines focused on her face, her appearance, her age. Every red carpet photo became evidence in a public trial nobody warned her she was entering. The same industry that once rewarded beauty now seemed obsessed with punishing her for trying to keep it. And underneath all of it was a deeper question Hollywood rarely wants to answer honestly. What actually happens to actresses after the world decides they are no longer young enough to remain untouchable? Because the truth is, Courteney Cox didn't just lose momentum. She became trapped inside a machine that had spent decades teaching women in Hollywood that aging naturally was dangerous, while simultaneously humiliating the women who tried to fight aging at all. And somewhere inside that contradiction, something began to break. Not just professionally, personally, emotionally, maybe even psychologically. To understand how one of television's biggest stars slowly became a cautionary tale, you have to go back long before the cosmetic procedures, before the tabloid criticism, before the internet turned every celebrity face into forensic evidence. Back to Alabama. Long before fame, Courteney Cox was just a quiet girl growing up in Birmingham, raised in a wealthy Southern family that, from the outside, looked stable and successful. But behind closed doors, things were more complicated. Her parents divorced when she was young, something she would later describe as deeply painful. And while divorce itself wasn't uncommon, the emotional aftermath left marks that followed her for years. Friends and colleagues would later describe Courteney as someone intensely driven by approval, organized, perfectionistic, constantly trying to hold things together. That trait would eventually make Monica Geller iconic. But it also hinted at something darker. Because perfectionism can become a survival mechanism. And Hollywood rewards that, until it destroys you. Before acting, Courteney originally pursued architecture and interior design. Acting wasn't necessarily some lifelong dream fueled by artistic obsession. In many ways, she drifted toward modeling first because of her appearance. Oh, symmetrical, commercially attractive. The kind of face the entertainment industry could immediately market. And that's important to understand about Courteney Cox's rise. Unlike certain actors celebrated as serious artists from the beginning, Courteney entered Hollywood during an era where women were often valued visually first and creatively second. The industry didn't initially present her as a powerhouse performer. It presented her as someone camera-friendly. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when an actress becomes famous partly because audiences perceive her as beautiful, aging inside Hollywood becomes psychologically brutal. Her early career reflected this dynamic perfectly. She appeared in commercials, small television roles, and music videos before finally landing the exposure that changed everything. In 1984, she appeared in Dancing in the Dark by Bruce Springsteen, pulled on stage during the iconic concert sequence that became permanently associated with the song. At the time, it seemed like harmless pop culture fun. But in retrospect, it also symbolized something larger. Courteney Cox became famous for being chosen. Chosen by the camera. Chosen by producers. Chosen by public attention. And Hollywood can become emotionally addictive when your entire value system starts revolving around being selected. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, she steadily built momentum through sitcoms and supporting roles. She worked constantly. She learned quickly. She developed a reputation for professionalism. But nothing truly transformed her career until 1994. That was the year Friends premiered. And almost overnight, everything changed. It's difficult to explain to younger audiences just how massive Friends became. It wasn't simply successful television. It became cultural infrastructure. The cast members evolved into global celebrities operating on a level few sitcom actors had ever experienced before. And yet even inside Friends, there were complicated dynamics shaping Courtney's image. Originally, she was considered for the role of Rachel Green, the glamorous, fashionable character eventually played by Jennifer Aniston. But Courtney reportedly pushed toward Monica instead, sensing more comedic depth in the character. That decision probably saved her creatively. Monica allowed Courtney to display timing, physical comedy, anxiety, competitiveness, and emotional vulnerability in ways a more conventional pretty girl role might not have. But there was another unintended consequence. Jennifer Aniston became the breakout phenomenon. And while Friends made all 6 cast members wildly famous, public fascination increasingly centered around Aniston's hair, love life, and America's sweetheart persona. Courtney remained respected, beloved even, but rarely mythologized in quite the same way. It created a strange imbalance. Courteney Cox was one of the biggest television stars on Earth, yet somehow often felt emotionally adjacent to the spotlight rather than fully at the center of it. And people close to the industry noticed something else too. She worked incredibly hard to maintain control. Control over her image. Control over production. Control over relationships. Control over aging. Control over how others perceived her. Again, Monica Geller suddenly didn't feel like acting anymore. It felt autobiographical. Still, during Friends, the system protected her. Success hides insecurity beautifully. As long as the ratings stayed enormous and the checks kept coming, deeper anxieties could remain buried underneath fame. But television history is filled with actors who discover a terrifying truth after starring in an iconic show. Sometimes the role that makes you famous also traps you forever. And once Friends ended in 2004, Courteney Cox was finally about to discover whether audiences truly loved her, or whether they only loved Monica. At first, things still looked promising. She had already gained credibility outside sitcom television through the Scream franchise, where she played ambitious reporter Gale Weathers. Unlike Monica, Gale was sharp-edged, vain, aggressive, and often unlikable, a role that proved Courtney could survive outside cozy sitcom energy. Ironically, Gale Weathers may have been closer to how Hollywood actually functions. Everyone smiling publicly. Everyone competing privately. Her relationship with David Arquette also became a major public fascination during this era. They met through Scream, married in 1999, and quickly became one of Hollywood's more recognizable couples. But beneath the red carpets and interviews, cracks were already forming. Because while Friends gave Courtney unimaginable fame, it also froze her inside a specific cultural image. Youthful, attractive, tightly controlled, endlessly watchable. And eventually, time begins attacking every single one of those things. Especially for women in Hollywood. The terrifying part wasn't that Courteney Cox got older. The terrifying part was what Hollywood made her believe she needed to do about it. And that's where the story truly begins to unravel. By the time Friends ended, the cast had achieved something almost impossible in Hollywood. They weren't just successful actors. They were cultural monuments. For 10 straight years, audiences had watched them grow up together, date, fail, marry, panic, and laugh through adulthood. Viewers didn't simply enjoy Friends, they emotionally depended on it. And when something becomes that deeply woven into people's lives, separating the actors from their characters becomes nearly impossible. That was the first hidden problem facing Courteney Cox after 2004. The second problem was far more dangerous. Hollywood had changed. The industry Courtney entered in the 1980s still revolved around network television dominance and traditional celebrity culture. But by the mid-2000s, entertainment was becoming younger, faster, harsher, and increasingly obsessed with reinvention. Reality television exploded. Internet gossip culture became vicious. Tabloids evolved into a non-stop economy of humiliation. And suddenly, aging actresses found themselves trapped under a microscope unlike anything previous generations experienced. For men in Hollywood, aging often created authority. For women, aging became treated like failure. Courteney Cox entered that era carrying impossible expectations. She wasn't just another actress getting older. She was Monica Geller, one of the most recognizable women in television history. Audiences had memorized her face during the peak years of youth and beauty culture in the 1990s. That image became frozen permanently in public memory. And once that happens to a celebrity, time itself becomes the enemy. At first, Courtney tried to evolve naturally. She continued appearing in the Scream sequels, balancing comedy with darker material. She launched new television projects. She remained professionally active. But underneath it all, there were signs she was struggling emotionally in ways the public didn't fully understand yet. Her marriage to David Arquette slowly became strained under the pressure of fame, career imbalance, and emotional distance. Over time, interviews revealed an uncomfortable reality. They processed Hollywood very differently. David Arquette leaned chaotic, impulsive, emotionally open. Courtney leaned controlled, perfectionistic, guarded. That combination can work temporarily. But over years, especially inside celebrity culture, those differences become magnified. There were reports of therapy, communication struggles, and emotional disconnect long before the public separation became official. And while tabloids framed the relationship as another Hollywood breakup, people close to the situation hinted at something more painful underneath. Courtney seemed exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that develops when someone spends decades trying to maintain an image that no longer feels sustainable. Then came the media obsession that would eventually redefine her entire public identity. Her face. It happened gradually at first. A slightly different appearance during interviews. Fuller cheeks. Less movement around the eyes. Small changes most ordinary people probably wouldn't even notice in daily life. But celebrity culture notices everything, especially when it comes to women aging publicly. The internet began dissecting every photograph. Entertainment blogs zoomed into screenshots. Headlines became increasingly cruel. Discussions about Courtney's talent or career quietly disappeared beneath conversations about cosmetic procedures. And this is where her story becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because the same culture mocking her appearance had spent decades teaching actresses that aging naturally would destroy their careers. Hollywood creates the fear, then punishes women for reacting to it. Courtney later admitted she got caught chasing youth through cosmetic fillers and procedures, describing it as a gradual process where she didn't initially realize how dramatically her appearance was changing. That honesty would eventually earn sympathy. But at the time, public reaction was brutal. People spoke about her face like it belonged to the internet instead of a human being. And psychologically, that kind of scrutiny can become devastating, especially for someone already wired toward perfectionism. There's a specific cruelty unique to celebrity culture. The world convinces famous women their value is tied to beauty, then acts morally outraged when those women become terrified of losing it. And Courteney Cox became one of the clearest examples of that contradiction. What made things worse was how quickly public perception began shifting from admiration to discomfort. In the 1990s, audiences viewed Courtney as relatable, attractive, funny, grounded. By the early 2010s, online conversations increasingly describe her as unrecognizable. That word followed her everywhere. Unrecognizable. As if the world was collectively grieving an earlier version of her while forcing the current version to watch. Meanwhile, professionally, things weren't collapsing entirely, but they were undeniably changing. Her series Cougar Town actually performed reasonably well and developed a loyal audience. Ironically, it showcased many of the strengths people originally loved about her. Sharp comedic instincts, vulnerability, awkward charm, emotional intelligence. But culturally, the show never became a defining phenomenon the way Friends had. And that matters psychologically for actors more than most people realize. Once someone experiences historic fame, ordinary success can begin feeling like failure. Especially when the media constantly frames every new project against impossible standards. No sitcom was ever realistically going to replicate Friends. But Hollywood rarely allows actors to exist outside comparison with their peak. Then came another painful shift. Nostalgia culture. As streaming platforms revived Friends for younger generations, the cast became trapped inside a strange emotional time capsule. Millions of viewers binge-watched the show repeatedly, permanently preserving the actors at 1990s ages in public consciousness. Jennifer Aniston remained culturally positioned as timeless. Lisa Kudrow earned growing respect for unconventional creative choices. Matthew Perry became associated with tragedy and addiction struggles. And Courtney? Increasingly, discourse centered around appearance. Not acting. Not artistic evolution. Not emotional depth. Appearance. It slowly overshadowed everything else. And somewhere during this period, the public stopped fully seeing her as a performer and began seeing her as a symbol of Hollywood aging anxiety itself. That transformation may have damaged her career more than any individual project failure ever could. Because once audiences become distracted by the conversation surrounding a celebrity rather than the actual work, the work itself starts disappearing. There was also another uncomfortable reality Hollywood rarely discusses openly. Courteney Cox belonged to a generation of actresses caught between two eras. Too early for the modern wave of conversations around aging naturally and rejecting impossible beauty standards. Too late to escape the brutal tabloid culture of the 2000s. Women today still face enormous pressure, but there's at least broader public awareness surrounding cosmetic anxiety, unrealistic expectations, and media cruelty. During Courtney's most criticized years, empathy came much slower. The internet often treated visible insecurity as entertainment. And while some critics argued her cosmetic decisions ruined her career, that explanation oversimplifies something much more tragic. Because her career wasn't destroyed overnight by vanity. It was slowly eroded by fear. Fear of disappearing. Fear of aging. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of no longer being chosen. The exact fears Hollywood quietly installs in actresses from the moment they become famous. Even her personal life reflected this emotional instability. Following her separation from David Arquette, Courtney openly discussed loneliness, therapy, and learning how to rebuild herself emotionally. Interviews became more vulnerable, less polished, less defensive. At times, she almost seemed aware that the public narrative surrounding her had spiraled beyond her control. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part was this. People still loved Monica Geller, but they no longer knew how to look at Courteney Cox without projecting their fears onto her. Fear of aging, fear of lost beauty, fear of changing identity, fear of time itself. By then, the industry had already moved on to younger stars, younger faces, younger franchises. Hollywood always reinvents itself by quietly replacing the people who once defined it. And for someone who spent decades at the center of mainstream culture, becoming peripheral can feel emotionally catastrophic. But the darkest chapter of Courteney Cox's story wasn't actually about cosmetic procedures or fading fame. It was about what happens psychologically when someone spends most of their life trying to stay lovable in an industry designed to make people feel temporary. And eventually, even she began admitting the chase had gone too far. At some point, the conversation around Courteney Cox stopped being about success altogether. It became about survival, not financial survival. By every traditional Hollywood standard, Courtney remained enormously successful. She had wealth, recognition, legacy, and a permanent place in television history. But emotionally, something else was happening beneath the surface, something far harder to measure. She was trying to figure out who she actually was once the world stopped reflecting back the version of herself she had spent decades protecting. And for celebrities, that can become terrifying. Because fame doesn't just change how other people see you. It changes how you see yourself. For years, Courtney's identity had been reinforced through applause, ratings, beauty standards, magazine covers, interviews, and public validation. Hollywood creates an environment where external attention becomes emotional oxygen. The industry trains actors to monitor reactions constantly. How audiences respond, how executives respond, how photographers respond, how aging affects visibility. Over time, that kind of environment quietly destroys internal stability. You stop asking whether you're happy. You start asking whether you're still wanted. And as the 2010s continued, Courteney Cox seemed increasingly aware that something inside her relationship with fame had become unhealthy. One of the most revealing moments came when she openly admitted regretting many of her cosmetic procedures. She described getting caught in a cycle where small adjustments slowly escalated over time. One filler led to another. One correction created a new insecurity. Eventually, she said, she looked in the mirror and realized she no longer resembled herself. That admission resonated because it sounded painfully human. Not glamorous. Not scandalous. Just sad. For years, Tabloids had mocked her appearance as if vanity alone explained everything. But vanity was only the surface layer. Underneath it was fear. The fear of becoming invisible in an industry where visibility is currency. And when Courtney began dissolving many of the fillers and returning to a more natural appearance, public reaction shifted almost immediately. People praised her. Headlines suddenly celebrated her honesty. But even that revealed something disturbing about celebrity culture. The public had first condemned her for aging, then condemned her for resisting aging, then praised her for undoing the resistance. At every stage, strangers still controlled the narrative. That's the psychological trap of fame. No matter what choice you make, the audience believes ownership over the outcome. And perhaps for the first time in years, Courtney seemed exhausted by the performance of perfection itself. There was a noticeable change in her interviews during this period. Less polished control, more vulnerability. She spoke openly about insecurity, therapy, relationships, loneliness, and the emotional confusion of getting older in Hollywood. Instead of pretending confidence, she sometimes admitted uncertainty outright. Ironically, that honesty may have made audiences connect with her again more deeply than they had in years. Because beneath the celebrity image, people suddenly recognized something familiar. A woman struggling with time. A woman trying to hold onto identity while watching the world evolve around her. A woman realizing too late that chasing permanence in Hollywood is impossible. Professionally, she never disappeared entirely. That's important to say clearly. Unlike some stars whose careers completely implode, Courtney remained active through producing, acting, directing, and returning periodically to major franchises like Scream. And when the Friends reunion finally arrived in 2021, audiences were reminded of something easy to forget beneath years of tabloid noise. She was genuinely talented. The chemistry between the cast still felt real. The emotional connection still existed. And during the reunion, there were moments where Courtney seemed visibly emotional, revisiting the years that permanently defined her life. But even that reunion carried an uncomfortable undertone. Nostalgia can be beautiful, can also be cruel. Because reunions force actors to confront the distance between who they were and who they became. Watching the Friends cast older, softer, wearier, and more emotionally reflective reminded audiences of their own aging too. The show no longer represented youthful possibility. It represented time passing. And maybe that's partly why so many people reacted emotionally to it. Not because Friends changed, because everyone else did. Then, in 2023, the death of Matthew Perry altered the emotional legacy of Friends forever. For Courteney Cox, the loss appeared deeply personal. Their on-screen relationship had become one of the most beloved parts of the series, but behind the scenes there was genuine affection between them. Perry had spoken warmly about her many times over the years, often describing her as caring and protective. After his death, Courtney shared emotional memories publicly, and people noticed something striking. The woman once mocked relentlessly by internet culture now seemed almost fragile in the public imagination. Not weak. Human. Aging had softened how audiences viewed her. The harshness surrounding cosmetic criticism faded somewhat, replaced by nostalgia, empathy, and reflection. But by then, the damage had already shaped years of her life. And that raises the larger question at the center of this entire story. Did Courteney Cox actually ruin her career? Or did Hollywood slowly convince her she was ruining it every time she aged? Because if you strip away the headlines and internet jokes, her downfall starts looking very different. She didn't commit career-ending crimes. She didn't implode publicly through addiction scandals or violent controversy. She didn't lose her talent. What she lost was cultural positioning. Hollywood stopped seeing her as the future and started seeing her as a reminder of the past. And in this industry, that transition can feel brutal, especially for actresses whose value was heavily tied to appearance from the beginning. The tragedy of Courteney Cox isn't really about cosmetic surgery. That became the symbol, not the cause. The deeper tragedy is how thoroughly Hollywood conditions women to fear becoming ordinary. Fear wrinkles. Fear age. Fear irrelevance. Fear replacement. Fear silence. Then once those fears become visible externally, the same system acts shocked by the emotional consequences. And maybe that's why Courtney's story still unsettles people today. Because it forces audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about celebrity culture itself. People love watching stars rise. They feel inspired by beauty, success, youth, glamour. But society becomes strangely uncomfortable watching those same stars remain human over time. Especially women. Especially women who visibly struggle with aging. In many ways, Courteney Cox became trapped between two impossible expectations. Remain eternally youthful, but never appear desperate to stay youthful. Almost nobody can survive that contradiction psychologically forever. And yet, despite everything, her legacy remains enormous. Friends still reaches new audiences every year. Monica Geller remains iconic. Younger viewers continue discovering her performances for the first time. The laughter still works. The emotional beats still land. The cultural imprint never fully disappeared. But perhaps the most haunting part of Courteney Cox's story is realizing that millions of people still love the version of her they remembered, while she herself may have spent years feeling terrified of no longer resembling that person. That's the hidden violence of fame. The world freezes you in time, while forcing you to keep living. And maybe Courteney Cox didn't ruin her career at all. Maybe she simply became one more Hollywood woman crushed beneath the impossible pressure of staying unchanged in a world obsessed with youth. A world that creates icons, then punishes them for becoming human.